I'd like to welcome you to this next video in a series of WORC topical videos presented by the Delta Regional Authority. In this one, we're going to cover how to complete three of the required elements, the SF424, the SF424A, and the budget narrative. I'm Nicole Dunn from Chamberlain Dunn LLC. We're a consulting firm based out of Indianapolis, and we've been working with DRA since round 5 of WORC, but we've been connected to the WORC initiative since its very beginning in 2019. The Delta Regional Authority was established in 2000 as a formal framework for joint federal-state collaboration to promote and encourage the economic development of the lower Mississippi River and Alabama Black Belt regions. DRA's region encompasses 252 counties and parishes in parts of Alabama, Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, and Tennessee. These topical videos are presented on behalf of DRA to assist applicants with their WORC applications. While I will walk you through the SF424, the 424A, and the budget narrative today, note there is a much longer, much more thorough and official video from Department of Labor available through Workforce GPS. I have the URL here on the slide, but that's a lot to type in. So you can just go to workforcegps.org and search for how to apply for a grant. In the search results, you should see one that looks like this, posted in February 2024. It has 3 parts, a grant application 101, a second focused on these budgetary forms, and a third grant application checklist. If you are new to these forms, I would strongly encourage you to watch the whole video, which I won't recreate here. But I will go through some of the WORC-specific form elements and some budget tips that we hope will be useful to you as you build out your budget. Before you get started, review that SF424 form ASAP to make sure you have all the basic information. You don't want to be caught at the very end of the process thinking that this form is just a formality and realizing you don't actually have everything it requires. At least glance through it and make sure you're not missing anything. Retrieve the most recent forms from the FOA link on grants.gov. They don't change very often, but you might as well be confident that you have the right ones, the most updated ones. But note there is no specified format for the budget narrative, so you will not find that on grants.gov. You're just looking for the 424 and the 424A. Consider your budget as the financial plan for achieving your objectives, because that's what the Department of Labor considers it. So your budget, your activities, and your timeline should all work together in a seamless and logical system. When your progress is reviewed, your federal project officer from Department of Labor will look at achievement of your activities and your performance metrics, of course, but they're also going to look at spend down as a measure of performance. If you're not spending money, they're going to assume you're not doing anything. So make sure that that budget is tied to those objectives and those strategies that you're outlining in your application. Consider differences across years when you're totaling. So on the SF424 and the 424A, they're just going to ask for totals, not annual amounts, but you want to be as accurate as possible in those totals and as logical as possible in your justification. So we would recommend breaking your budget down in the planning phases and then roll it back up. So that will also help you write a clear and compelling budget narrative that demonstrates reasonableness and costs year to year. Think about the resources you will need for all aspects of implementation. Direct activity implementation is the most obvious, but also consider outreach, consider data tracking and reporting, financial tracking and reporting. Consider whether you will need any consulting support, especially at the beginning, to get your project up and running. Also take time to run financial reports and understand the historical costs that your organization has had for things like salaries and fringe and indirect costs, because federal guidelines require you to be consistent across funding sources. Understand the difference between contracts and subawards, as well as cost limitations and restrictions and requirements. There are federal definitions for the difference between contracts and subawards. They're both included in contractual, and we'll talk about them a little bit later, but you want to make sure you know the difference and you show them separately in that budget narrative. For other aspects where there's some discretion, the most important thing is to have a policy, to follow your own policy, and to be consistent across federal grants. And finally, think of your budget versus your actual as that performance management analysis. If you're watching this, you probably take budgeting seriously, but I still can't stress this enough. Budgets can really intimidate people, but they're a communication tool and a management tool. So make sure your narrative is clear enough that if a new program manager comes in, they know what was and what was not included in those broad cost categories. Moving into the SF424, the application for federal assistance. This form is really pretty straightforward, but there are some sections you don't have to fill in and some specific pieces you may not know about if you've not applied for work in the past. Make sure to have your unique entity identifier, or your UEI, from SAM.gov. If you are not already registered, start that process as soon as possible, and make sure your subawardees know that they will also have to be registered and have a UEI if you are awarded. I'll go over some of that specific details that have tripped up work applicants, but if you're unsure about anything, I would encourage you to watch that longer explanation in the DOL training video that I mentioned, and that starts on slide 15 of that video that DOL has posted. In item 1, type of submission, you should check application. Item 2, type of application, should be new because this is not a continuation of a previous project or a revision to a previously submitted SF424. Items 3 through 7 can be left blank. Throughout item 8, your applicant information, double check that your information matches your SAM.gov registration information. In item 8D, address, you have to include an actual address that is not a PO box. In item 10, name of federal agency, enter Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration. Item 11, CFDA, is 17.280, and CFDA title is WIOA, Dislocated Worker National Reserve Demonstration Grants. Number 12, funding opportunity number is FOA-ETA-24-08, and the title is Workforce Opportunity for Rural Communities, WORC, Round 6, a grant initiative for the Appalachian, Delta, and Northern Border regions. And you can find all of that on the cover page of the FOA. The format for item 16 is 2 characters for the state abbreviation and 3 characters for the district number, or in other grant cases, you can put all if all districts in a state are affected. In this case with WORC, because all Delta Regional Authority regions cover only part of each state, you will need to list out each district affected by your project. You cannot just say all across the whole state. For item 17, everyone's proposed start date should be September 30th, 2024. You do have control over your proposed end date, which is no more than 36 months from September 30th, 2024. One unofficial recommendation, if for any reason you want to propose fewer than 36 months, it can be to your benefit to end your project at the end of a quarter. If you go even one day into the next quarter, you will need to issue all the required reports for that quarter anyway, so it's typically simplest to end with a quarter end. For item 18, cost sharing or matching is not required for WORC, so we recommend putting your total work budget in federal and in total and put zeros in all the other boxes. Last year, an applicant ran into an issue where their total exceeded the allowable grant ceiling because they had included other funds in this section in B, C, or D, or E, or F. So avoid all of that. Their application ended up being excluded. Avoid those issues, just put the work funds here in federal and put them in total. For item 19, you can check work is not covered by E012372. And note that with item 20, the question about federal debt is in regards to the organization, not the signatory. Hopefully it's not the case with the signatory either, but just note that it's a question about the organization and not the person signing the form. Item 21, your authorized representative should have the organizational authority to sign for the application. This can be the same as the point of contact identified in 8F, but we would recommend having the point of contact and authorized representative be 2 different people, since both roles receive official DOL communication. I have personally seen communication delayed because the same person was listed in both places, that person didn't see the email from Department of Labor, and grantees missed out on things like the new grantee convening or other information that was being released. One final note, the authorized representative can electronically sign the form when you submit your application online. And those are the highlights of the SF424. right, moving into the SF424A and the budget narrative, which really go together. Before you get started on your budget, make sure you understand the cost object categories, the cost principles, and the allowable activities that can actually be paid for under work. So object cost categories for work include personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, and other expenses, and also indirect, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Note that new construction is not an allowable cost. No matter the type of cost, it must meet 5 criteria legally and then a 6th to keep in mind. The cost must be for an allowable activity. So staff time and fringe benefits would be an allowable cost when that time is spent in support of an allowable grant activity. That time would not be allowed to be charged to the grant if the person is doing something other than direct grant activities. So as you're budgeting for staff time and associated fringe, consider what portion of the staff member's time will be spent on allowable grant activities versus other projects or tasks like supervision or time entry or things like that that are not grant specific. Those would be captured in indirect. The second is allocable, and that means that the cost is incurred specifically for the award for the project. So let's say you're going to budget for a new case management system that helps with work data collection and management and reporting. If 100% of that system is used for your work grant, you could budget for the cost to be 100% allocable to work. If you are going to use that system for non-work case management too, then the system could be partially allocable to the grant, and therefore you could charge part of the cost to the grant, but not the entire thing. The third is that the cost must be reasonable. Unofficially, this is the sniff test. So an example I've seen in another federal agency's guidance is headphones. There are $400 noise canceling headphones and there are $40 basic headphones. And essentially, you're going to be asked to budget for the minimum cost to reasonably do a good job. This doesn't mean you have to necessarily purchase the cheapest available thing, but a prudent person should be able to look at it and see that, yes, this was an appropriate level of expense for the job that needed to be done, for the task that needed to be accomplished. The fourth is necessary, and it's similar to reasonable, but this one asks, was this cost needed in order to meet the goals and objectives? Or put another way, could the goals and objectives have been met without this cost? Your budget narrative is essentially the place where you are asked to explain why each cost is reasonable and necessary. The fifth is that it is consistently applied, which means you're treating costs consistently, whether they're being supported by federal funds or non-federal funds, and you're treating costs in accordance with your organization's own policies. An example here is salary. So similar positions should be paid similar salaries, and if there's a difference, it should be explained by something other than the funding source or the funding amount available, and it should be in line with your organization's policies. The sixth is less of a regulatory issue and more of a competitiveness issue, but your budget should be aligned with the design that you propose. So it needs to be logically connected to the strategies and activities that you talk about in your project design section. What are those allowable activities which your cost can support? They are outlined starting on page 11 of the FOA, and they include training and other employment-related activities, participant support services, employer services, strategic planning, and equipment purchases and renovations. The video on the FOA basics goes into each one of these allowable activity categories. So if you've not already watched that or have not already read thoroughly in the FOA, I would encourage you to check out that video before you start budgeting. Note also there are caps on how much you can spend for strategic planning and for equipment purchases and renovations. So make sure you're familiar with those. You can also incur costs for providing incentives to participants to report on outcomes that you can't easily obtain from another source. You can have indirect costs, like a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement or cost allocation plan, or if you do not have either of those, you can use the de minimis rate of 10% of modified total direct costs, and we'll talk about those in a little bit here. You can also use funds for subrecipient awards, although make sure you know that the department expects that the lead applicant has the organizational capacity to implement the project, and it discourages pass-through awards where the lead applicant is basically not involved in the operational aspects or only nominally involved in the operational aspects and passes through a majority of the actual work to subrecipients. So you're not disqualified if you do that, but the FOA does say that you are strongly discouraged. The section here on other funding restrictions also mentions things you specifically cannot spend money on. So these would be non-allowable costs. And that would include food, unless food is justified as a supply for training purposes. So for example, you have a culinary arts training program that would purchase food for training purposes. The second is profit, and the third is excessive salaries and bonuses. And you can find that entire section and the definition for excessive salaries and bonuses starting on page 32 of the FOA. One more thing before we jump into these forms is we often get a few questions about this. And the first we get is, what is the required match? There is no required match for WORC. And as I mentioned before, the best practice is not to include any matched or leveraged funds on your 424 or your 424A. The second and third questions have to do with per participant costs, whether there is an overall target to shoot for, and whether there's a maximum for supportive services. And the answer to both of these questions is the same. The FOA does not specify any kind of cost per participant targets or maximum for supportive services. It all goes back to the question of reasonable and necessary, as well as the extent to which you can make the case for the cost versus overall impact of your project. So that is an element of competitiveness that you will have to judge for yourself. Okay, moving on to completing the SF424A. A little more effort is required here for the 424A than for the 424. While none of the parts of your WORC application should be taken lightly, I cannot stress enough the importance of a well-developed budget that is closely and logically tied to your implementation plan. The two need to inform each other, and there will likely be some back and forth. You have to have a pretty clear idea of your implementation strategies in order to develop a good budget, but in turn, your implementation may be constrained by the budget you have available, particularly if you end up having partners, you start getting their budgets in, there's going to have to be some shifts and some negotiation sometimes as to what is actually realistic to accomplish with the funds that are available. So the sections of the SF424A are listed here. You have the budget summary, budget categories, non-federal resources, forecasted cash needs, future funding, and other budget information. Sections A, B, C, and D should show budget items as a single function or activity and for the entire period of performance. So I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. Starting with section A of the 424A, you'll see that there are several lines you could potentially fill out depending on the application and its specification. For WORC, we are just looking at line 1. So column A, the CFDA title is WIOA, Dislocated Worker National Reserve Demonstration Grants. Column B, your CFDA number is 17.280. Column E, total federal amounts being requested through the entire period of performance. Do not show leverage funds or program income. You can skip lines 2, 3, and 4 because you are only applying for this one grant, which is captured as a single activity. Do not enter separate years on separate lines. Put it all in line 1. Section B has quite a few components, so let's talk about those 9 object cost categories that you must use to budget your project. Again, they are personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, not construction in this case, other, and indirect. So in line I, you'll add the first 8 cost categories together, all but indirect. And in line K, you'll add total direct plus total indirect to get your total overall. All costs must be addressed in the budget narrative. And note that any program income generated from a program has to be used back again for program activities. So everything goes in column 1, which should match line 1 from the previous page. I've seen grantees spread the budget out across these columns as if they are spreading them out across the 3 years of their period of performance, but that is not correct. You are applying for a single grant program, so you use a single column on this form. Also, make sure you have 0 in construction. You may be able to do an amendment to pay for capital expenditures, but construction and property acquisition are not allowable under WORC. Because the SF424A and the budget narrative go hand in hand, I'm going to jump over to an overview of the budget narrative, and then we'll walk through each of these object cost categories. As I mentioned, there's no specified format for the budget narrative, but it is strongly recommended that you follow those cost categories on the SF424A. As we've discussed in other videos, do not make reviewers hunt for things they will not. So your budget needs to be aligned across all the places it's discussed. So outlining your budget narrative according to those cost categories just makes sense. It makes it easy to follow that logic. Your budget narrative is the place where you can explain how you came to the totals of each line item on the SF424A. It's your opportunity to justify those costs, to show the thoughtfulness put into them, and demonstrate that they are appropriate, they are reasonable, and they are necessary, and also that they are sufficient for achieving the work objectives and your specific outcomes, that you're asking for enough resources to achieve what you say you're going to achieve. So since we recommend writing your budget narrative according to those object cost categories, let's go through each one in turn. The first is personnel, which is your salaries and wages of positions or portions of positions paid for with grant funds. You'll include fringe on the next line, so leave that out here. You'll also include subrecipient funds later. So personnel of any subrecipients or contractors will go under contractual and will be part of their budgets. It is a best practice for those subrecipients and those contractors to also be providing you budgets that are aligned to the cost categories, but the entirety of their budget will be in that contractual line. For the purpose of your SF424A as the lead applicant, this section on this line includes only the personnel you will be paying for directly as the applicant. You'll also want to include in your budget narrative the employees by job title if new positions, or by position description or title if they're current positions. The salary for each, the percent paid for by the grant, the total compensation paid to each, and again, be reasonable and consistent with similar work within and outside your organization. The budget narrative is also the place where you can spread out those costs in a table or some other form across years, and to show how those totals are being reached. The second is fringe benefits, which again should be reasonable and consistent with what similarly situated individuals within your organization and your labor market receive. In your budget narrative, explain the types of benefits included, as well as how you arrived at that number. If you're applying a percent of benefits, if you have a standard that you use organizationally, however you do that. You can do it in different ways, just show your work. On the SF424A, include the total amount of fringe that will be covered with grant funds over the course of your period of performance. If you do not already have a set rate or a previous rate that you've used for fringe benefits, the CDC Foundation, in its guide on developing budgets for federal grants, provides two ways you can calculate it, one for salaried employees and the other for hourly. In both cases, you need an understanding of the cost of total fringe as well as annual wages per employee. So for salaried employees, their annual wage is easy because that's their total annual salary. For hourly employees, you'll want to first multiply their rate by the number of weeks worked in a year and the number of hours worked in a week to get their annual wages. Then in either case, you divide that total fringe benefit cost for that employee by their annualized wage for that employee, and you multiply it by 100 to get a percentage. The third category is travel, and you'll want to explain who is going where, estimated when, and why that travel is necessary. When calculating, you'll include the number of trips and how you reached your figures. Did you use estimates? Did you use historical costs? Did you use a standard mileage rate? Things like that. It is acceptable to provide estimates due to inherent unpredictability, but you still must cite your computation basis. You can't just put a round number down. You have to give some rationale for how you arrived at that number. And consider travel for all aspects of implementation, from outreach to meetings with partners and anything else outlined in your organization's travel policy and in your implementation plan and your timeline. If you have multiple sites and it is in your organization's policy to pay employees for transportation between sites in the same day, and doing so is necessary for project implementation, you can budget for that here. So let's say it's in your organization's policy that you don't pay for regular commuting to an employee's primary location of work, but you do pay for driving between sites or driving to meetings. So make sure you factor that in here and explain how you do that and why you did that. The biggest thing here is that it is very much in your interest to have a written travel policy and to follow it consistently, or else to follow the federal travel policy. Next is equipment, and this is where you'll put any capital expenditures you'd like to budget for. Equipment must have a unit cost of $5,000 or more and a useful life of 1 year or more. Otherwise, that expense should be budgeted for in supplies. If it doesn't meet either one of those criteria, it would go in supplies. As with other categories, describe in your narrative what the cost is and why it's necessary, and provide the estimated unit cost. Remember, you will need approval from your FPO, from your federal project officer, before you can purchase equipment if you're awarded. This approval can take time, and you cannot spend those funds until you have that approval. So as with the other categories, you'll justify your costs and how you arrived at them, but also consider that you are writing this today, but you may not be buying equipment for 6 or 9 or 12 months from now. So consider what might happen to costs over the next year if you can. We've seen projects have significant delays because they didn't forecast an increase in cost over the year between writing it and procuring it, and now they have to go do a budget modification, and if their entire project is predicated on purchasing this equipment, they're essentially stuck and losing time for the first 6 months or more. So I'm not telling you to necessarily do or not do anything, just consider all of that when you're budgeting. Next is supplies, which of course is anything with a unit cost of under $5,000 and or a usable life of 1 year or less. Your cost estimate basis here could be vendor quotes, it could be historical cost to your organization, some other defensible means, but again here just be sure to explain where the figures came from. So that's what you need to do here in the budget narrative. The contractual line includes two things: subawards, which are made to subrecipients who are carrying out part of the award on your behalf, and contracts, which are made to contractors or vendors who are providing goods or services, generally through a procurement relationship. Contractors generally operate in a competitive environment. They could provide these goods or services to others in the course of their normal business operations, and they do not generally have a say in the direction of your project. They also typically have a commitment to deliver goods or services by a specified date under the contract. Subawards, in contrast, are made to subrecipients who have performance measures that align with the performance measures of the award. Not necessarily all of the same performance measures that you have, but their performance measures should roll up to some degree to the overall measures you've set for the project. So theirs will be specific to their piece of the grant that they're carrying out. Subrecipients typically have programmatic decision-making responsibilities, and they are using the funds to carry out the program for public purposes specific to the award. They may be doing the same kind of work in other funded projects, but they're not really competing in an open market to offer it as a packaged service. Instead, they're essentially carrying out the grant in your stead. It's really important to note the difference between contracts and subawards for compliance purposes, even though they get rolled up in the same line item here. You have different responsibilities based on the type of relationship. So much like other categories, you don't want to have your project delayed because there was an error made as you were writing your narrative for this category. For subawards, you're going to want to provide the description of each entity, what the subaward will cover, and how much that subrecipient will receive. And note that as a pass-through entity with subawards, you are responsible for your subrecipients. You're going to be responsible for conducting risk assessments on them, for monitoring their performance on a regular basis through formal grant monitoring. You're responsible for monitoring their handling of funds, things like that. Their performance is your grant performance, so choose your subrecipients wisely. This year's FOA also notes that applicants are, quote, strongly discouraged from setting up full pass-through grants where the applicant subawards a majority of the grant funds and operational activities. So you can absolutely have subrecipients on your project, and most work grantees do, but be mindful of that note in the FOA as you're thinking about total budget and how much you're passing through to subrecipients. So in this section, you'll include subawards and also the funds to be contracted out, the products or professional services, and provide a brief justification for any contractors that you've already selected at the time of writing. You don't necessarily have to have those goods and services specifically identified yet. You can also describe them here, but if you have already selected the specific good or service and or the specific contractor, include the process that you went through to identify them, and if you are following your organization's procurement policy or some other justification for why they are being written into your grant. Include whatever the cost basis is, a flat fee or an hourly rate, and the types of expenses the contract covers. For professional services, justify that necessity and that appropriateness, as well as the total time you anticipate that professional service provider spending. We skip G because construction costs are not allowed. Remember, any capital expenditure should go in equipment. So the construction line G will be 0. Other costs, H, might include rent, meeting costs, performance management software, or participant data systems. This is also where you would budget for participant incentives to respond to requests for outcome data. Or if you have any other allowable costs that are not covered in any of the other line items but are allowable per the FOA, you can include them here. Just again, explain everything in your budget narrative and in every section, but especially here on this kind of catch-all category, what would go into other costs. The last cost category is indirect. Here you can use a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement if you have one, or you can use the de minimis rate, which is 10% of modified total direct cost, or MTDC. This is a section where if you're using the de minimis rate, you will want to carefully review what is included in MTDC because not all costs are included and not all direct costs are included in MTDC. So it does include direct salaries and wages, applicable fringe benefits, materials and supplies, services, travel, and up to the first $25,000 of each subaward. It excludes any equipment or capital expenditures, any charges for patient care, if that's relevant here, which probably not for work, any rent costs, tuition remission, scholarships and fellowships, participant support costs, other subcontracts, and the portion of each subaward in excess of $25,000. So again, if you're going to use the de minimis rate, make sure you understand each of those categories and you are only applying the applicable cost to the modified total direct cost. So here you're going to include how much you will plan to recover in indirect, but be sure you have the systems in place to track those costs internally and that you are being consistent across federal grants. One last item here, which probably only applies to a few of you, is program income, which is listed at the very bottom of section B on the SF424A. You are allowed to generate program income with work funds, but that income must go toward project activities. You are not allowed to generate profit. So you will include it here in line 7, but do not add program income to any of the other totals, including your overall total reported on the SF424 or other portions of the 424A. So do include it in the budget narrative, but if it is not applicable to you, if you don't intend to generate program income, you can just leave that blank and you don't need to address it in the budget narrative. Section C is about match, which I've mentioned is not required for work. If you complete this section, you will have to report it every time you do a financial report. So you can decide ultimately how you want to handle this. It's not required for work, and as I mentioned, it actually caused a problem for a work applicant in the past by including it, but you can ultimately decide if you want to include it and report on it each time just for fun anyway, but I would not recommend doing so. You can also leave sections D and E blank as well. There are a few common mistakes grantees make with budgeting that I want to mention here before I wrap up. The first is calculation errors. We know how it is in the final scramble of grant writing, especially if you have subawards or anticipate contracts and you're waiting on those final numbers. But use a spreadsheet, double check and triple check your calculations, and double and triple check that you've included the same amounts on each form and in each place where you discuss those totals. Grantees also sometimes misclassify costs or misapply indirect costs. So lean on your finance people if you have them and make sure you're following federal code and also your own internal policies. So much of grantee monitoring, though not all, is based on your own internal controls and policies. So don't guess here. If you have people in your organization whose job it is to handle things like this, or who may have knowledge of how you've dealt with various budget items and federal grants in the past, it's worth the conversation before everything is finalized. Another one here is not considering historical projections or trends in costs, under budgeting, or on the flip side, over budgeting for things like travel if you can find digital solutions. Or we see grantees who wish they had budgeted more for support staff, thinking that a single program manager or project manager could do it all. These are large, complex, multi-year projects, so consider the entire life cycle of getting a participant interested, screened, trained, coached, supported, completed, placed, and followed up with. Consider the capacity that you need to track and report on financial and programmatic performance, including tracking employment outcomes for all of your participants and completing record level, individual level data forms for Department of Labor on a quarterly basis. So think about all the ways you might want to support participants and what it will really take to do so internally and externally. And at the same time, though, sending money back is embarrassing. Nobody really wants to do that. So find that sweet spot where you're confident you're asking for exactly what you need to get this job done. Just a few final reminders. We have an entire video series through the Delta Regional Authority at the URL you see here. Start your UEI, SAM.gov, and grants.gov registration processes now if you haven't already. And you can submit any technical questions to the email address you see here, dol-eta-dwg@dol.gov. Reference this FOA and be sure to include a contact name and number. Note there are a lot of questions DOL can't or won't answer, so you can also submit questions to us. My email address is going to be on the next slide, and we will do what we can to point you in the right direction and answer anything we are able to. And of course, your application is due by Thursday, June 20th, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, submitted only in electronic format through grants.gov. That's it for me. I'm Nicole Dunn. You can reach me at nd@chamberlindunn.com. Note that the end of Chamberlain is LIN. There's no A in the end there. And I would be glad to answer any questions that I can. Best of luck on your application.